and in the future. Hudson carries on that legacy today. We are grateful to have representatives from many of our international friends joining us here today. Many of them from some of our allies are research fellows and senior fellows here at Hudson Institute to improve our understanding and our ability to talk with friends and allies in substantive and continuous ways. I particularly want to thank Ambassador Sandhu for his work advancing the Indo-American relationship. He's been a great friend, and we've had many conversations with him, and I want to thank him for his great representation of India here and his diligent efforts to try to help us understand what's going on in India and in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Ambassador. For these and many other reasons, we are honored to host India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. For this discussion, he's going to be joined by my colleague, Walter Russell Mead. This discussion is important, I think, as is evident to most people here, because both of our countries are at a critical point in the history of the world, and the future of that world is going to largely be shaped by our ability to work together and with other allies around the globe to create a better and safer future, rather than a more chaotic and a future filled with conflict. Therefore, this is a critical time for us to not only better understand, but better figure out ways to work together as we have never worked together before. Dr. Jaishankar is a member of the upper house of India's parliament. Before assuming his current role in government, he served as foreign secretary and has been India's ambassador to the United States and India's ambassador to the People's Republic of China, among other countries. I don't think I need to tell this group, he is one of the most respected diplomats in the world. He is considered one of the most competent and around the world, if people have problems, they frequently call him to help them sort it out. He is also the author of a best-selling book, The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World, which compellingly articulates India's current and future position in the world, and I recommend it highly. Many times people want to understand others through distance. I think it's very important to use the expertise of people who are at the front line and have thought deeply and experienced deeply the issues that are going to shape our world. Joining him for this discussion is Walter Russell Mead. He is the Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at Hudson Institute. Many of you know him as the Global View columnist of the Wall Street Journal, and he is the James Clark Chance Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College in New York. Walter multitasks. He's author of numerous books, including the widely recognized Special Provenance, America's Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World. His newest book, Ark of a Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, has been recognized by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal as Best Book of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this important discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaishankar and my colleague, Walter Russell Mead.
And I think we'll begin with Dr. Jaishankar speaking for a few minutes, and then we will go to question and answer. Would you like to speak from the podium or from your?
It would be
yes.
easier.
Okay, terrific.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you, and it's a real pleasure to be back here. It's been some years, but of course we've been talking to each other. I was told that the topic for the day is India and the new Pacific Order. Am I correct? Now, I wasn't sure whether the Pacific was with a capital P or a small p, but either way, we are into it. For many people, I think, particularly in the United States, it's probably a new idea, something very different to think of India in terms of the Pacific region, Pacific Order, the Pacific Community of Nations. And the fact that we have such a title and it seems natural today is an indication, actually, is one indication of what has changed in the world. Viewed from India's perspective, we today do much more business to the east of India than we do to the west of India historically. We look at our key trade partners, we look at our important economic partners, we look at a lot of our strategic interests. A lot of it is today extending eastwards into the Pacific and beyond. Now, what this has given rise to in the last few years is a concept of Indo-Pacific. That too has been readily embraced by many and contested by a few. But again, it's a concept that has actually gained ground. I often reflect on the fact that the separation, in a way, of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific region is something actually which was an outcome really of the Second World War. That if one looked at a global strategy and global understanding, before that the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean were dealt with in a much more integrated way, with the emphasis on the Indian. So in some ways, what you are seeing today of the Indo-Pacific coming together, the idea of India contributing in many ways to a Pacific order, is something which reflects really the rebalancing that is today taking place in the world, a rebalancing in which the changed capabilities, positioning, and attitudes of the United States is the central driving factor. But also in one in which the rise of China and its implications is obviously a very, very crucial issue. But to which there are many other moving parts, but an important one is also that of India. Now, related to the Indo-Pacific, again, over the last 6 years, another concept which has gained ground is that of the Quad. It was revived in 2017 after a gap. It was attempted first in 2007. It did not last. It was revived after a decade. It's an interesting question why it worked this time when it did not work the first time. Not just worked, but if you see in 17, it was done at a bureaucratic level, at an undersecretary level in the US. In 19, it became a ministerial forum. In 21, it became a presidential, prime ministerial forum. And at every stage, there were people who said, well, this is where it sort of fizzles out. And it seems to be growing from strength to strength. And we will have the privilege of hosting the summit next year in India. In terms of the Pacific order, I think a lot of the global concerns are most acute in the Pacific. One of course, is the larger issue of how do you maintain stability in the middle of very major change taking place, because often sharp changes in balances of power and interest and influence can create risks whose management therefore becomes a very crucial issue. But there are some other, I think, key issues today in the world which center particularly around the Pacific. One of them is the building of reliable and resilient supply chains, because the experiences of the last few years have taught us their importance. The other is the promotion of trust and transparency on anything to do with digital. So whether it's telecom or whether it's artificial intelligence or whether it's the car that you are driving, really today the importance of trusted providers, trusted sources, trusted geographies. I think this is today a very, very big issue. The third is the over-concentration of production, especially of manufacturing, that if you have over-concentration which is liable to be leveraged, had it happened in any of our national economies, it would have attracted antitrust provisions. Yet it happens in the world, and we are all blissfully, we are sanguine about it. So what are the dangers of over-concentration? What are the implications of over-concentration? How are they leveraged? How are they weaponized? I think is a very big issue today in the world. And if you put it together, I would suggest to you that the world is badly in need of some form of re-globalization. That globalization itself is undeniable. It has struck very deep roots. It has tremendous benefits, nobody doubts that. But the particular model of globalization, which has evolved over the last 25 years, obviously has a lot of risks inherent in it. And today, how to address those risks and create a safer world is part of the challenge facing the Pacific Order. So let me just end with one last remark, because John, there was something you said, which was India and the United States have never really worked before together. I think that is a very thoughtful observation, because dealing with each other is not the same as working with each other. In the past, we have always dealt with each other, sometimes not entirely happily. But working with each other is really uncharted territory. It is a territory which we have both entered in the last few years. And it has required both of us really to overcome what my Prime Minister called the hesitations of history when he spoke to the Congress a few years ago. So how do we create that ability and the convergences and hopefully the comfort to work together? I think that would be very crucial to the future of the Pacific Order. So perhaps with those remarks, Walter, if you would allow me, we can start the conversation.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for those remarks, and thank you so much for being here. You really do Hudson great honor. I want to say I'm especially grateful because while Hudson is a nonpartisan think tank and we work with people in both parties, many would say that Hudson has closer relations sometimes with the Republican Party. So we especially appreciate that you have reached out in a way, in a bipartisan way, toward the opposition. It reminds us that both India and the United States are democracies, do believe in pluralism, and we at Hudson appreciate this sign of India's concern, faith in that principle. This is also, by the way, I just saw yesterday that Swaminathan had died at 98, I believe. He was an example of Indian-American cooperation, not on the governmental level, but his work with Norman Borlaug helped establish the Green Revolution, which has been transformational in the lives of literally billions of people in India and around the world. And this is, this reminds me at least of what the US and India, what Americans and Indians can accomplish together. And I hope we will be seeing more of it. Minister Jaishankar, I should say first too, before I get into my questions, that he has agreed to take questions from the floor. And the way we do this at Hudson is we ask people to email questions. I know you all have cell phones here. I know you know how to text while listening. So we ask you to send questions to press, P-R-E-S-S, @hudson.org. And those questions will come up to me. I'll have an opportunity to look at them, consolidate them where we have several questions on the same topic, and perhaps also forestall the possibility, it's not unknown, that sometimes people confuse questions with speeches. So please do that, and we will conclude the meeting with your questions. At the G20 and elsewhere, we hear that India is looking for a change in international architecture or in the way world politics works and world institutions. I've also heard India described as a reformist rather than as a revisionist power. It seeks real change in the status quo, but not necessarily in the way that perhaps some of our colleagues and friends in Russia and China might do. What is it that India is looking for in change in the world situation, and how does that affect, do you think, India's vision of where we're all going?
Let me put it to you this way, that the world as we live it today is largely a Western construct. Now, if you looked at the world architecture, to use your words, there's been obviously enormous change in the last 80 years. If one looked at the major economies of the 1940s and 50s, they are very different from the major economies today, and nothing illustrates it more than the G20 itself. The list of the G20 will tell you is the easiest way of actually getting a sense of the changes in the world. Now, for India, when we confront a largely Western created architecture, obviously we would like to encourage and facilitate and induce and pressurize changes which are badly needed. But it is done to add a non-Western layer and a input. So I make this very important distinction where India is concerned. India is non-Western. India is not anti-Western. So when we speak about, and I give you an example which we discussed even at the G20. It's very clear today that if we are serious about climate action, if you are looking to sustain, to ensure that sustainable development goals are well resourced, then somewhere we have to find the financial muscle for that. Now, for us still, it is the international financial institutions, the bank, the World Bank and the fund, which will be at the core of that effort. So a lot of what we are seeking to do is to improve and I would say refresh institutions, make them more fit for purpose. And that even applies to the United Nations. We do believe today that a United Nations where the most populous country is not in the Security Council, when the fifth largest economy is not there, when a continent of 50 plus countries is not there, that United Nations obviously lacks credibility and to a large degree effectiveness as well. So the whole, when we approach the world, it's not with a sort of pull down the pillars kind of approach. It is very much what can we do to make it better, fitter, efficient, purposeful. That's the kind of mindset we bring to bear.
Well, I have to say I find myself in agreement with much of what you say, especially when I look at the United Nations, and I think that in the official UN system, India is sort of said to be equal to Luxembourg. They both have one vote in the General Assembly.
I like Luxembourg.
Well, I have nothing against. Actually, if you're ever in Luxembourg, eat the duck. It's fantastic.
Okay.
But but the idea that those two political entities should be equally weighted in the United Nations is, I think, an absurdity that future generations will not be able to understand when they look back at our times. Now, over the summer, you said that there are three big Eurasian powers, Russia, China, and India, and that the Indo-Russian relationship is not transactional, this is geopolitical. How do you see India-Russia relations, especially at a time where Russia and China appear to be working much more closely together than before?
You know, this approach is not something new. In fact, since independence in India, this has been the basic thinking about our geopolitical predicament, which is if there are three major polities occupying the landmass, the central landmass of the world, then how do you ensure that there is a balance, and how do you ensure you are not facing an adverse balance? Now, we had a phase, I would say late 40s, which were particularly testing for us. You know, this was when this is still Stalin's Soviet Union at that time. I think the Indian diplomacy very sensibly set to work on the basic international relations principle of your neighbor's neighbor. So your neighbor's neighbor is intrinsically well disposed towards you. Since the 50s, actually, there's been a very systematic mutual cultivation. Now, it's not just us thinking about Soviet Union, now Russia. It's also the Russians thinking about India with the same principle and the same logic in mind. Now, that actually is such a powerful logic, at least in our part of the world, that if you consider international relations over the last 70 years, you know, the US-Russian relations, the China-Russia relations, the US-China relations, Europe, pretty much every big relationship in the last 70 years has seen a great deal of volatility. You had sharp ups and downs. The India-Russia is very exceptional. It's been very steady. It may not be spectacular, you know. So it may have stabilized at a certain level, but it has not seen that kind of ups and downs which your relations with Russia or China's relations with Russia or Europe's relationship with Russia has seen through. And that's in itself a statement. Now, if one looks at the world today, Russia today, I think as a consequence of what is going on in Ukraine, it seems to me clear, and I assume it seems to them clear, that in many ways Russia's relationship with the West has broken down. And in that case, it's logical that Russia focuses more on the Asian side of Russia. Though historically, Russia has always seen itself as a European power. So you are actually seeing a reinvention of Russia as a consequence of what is happening in Ukraine. You can see much of that will naturally focus on China, because that's the first and the largest country and economy that Russia encounters when it wheels around and looks at Asia. But then again, India will and has come into calculations as well. So I would predict actually a Russia which would consciously focus on the non-Western world, away from Europe, away from the United States. Look much more at Asia, look possibly at other regions as well, but Asia is economically the most active.
Yep.
So I guess that's what you're going to see.
Okay. There's a growing recognition in the United States and India, I think, bolstered by Prime Minister Modi's tremendously successful visit last summer, that our two countries' interests are broadly and even strategically aligned in a way perhaps they have not been in the past. And this is that shift from dealing with one another to working with one another that you mentioned. Where do you see the principal areas where our interests are aligned, and what areas of tension and difference do you see at this point?
I would say they are aligned in a set of areas. In a kind of a geostrategic way, they are aligned. That we both want to see a certain stability and a certain set of rules and a certain, I would say, distribution of power, which is advantageous to both of us, and our interests are not clashing in that respect. So at the biggest picture level, I would say there's a very powerful case really for India and the US to work together. So if you look even within our systems, historically, it was actually our national security side which had the greatest suspicion or reservations about each other. Today, it's the national security side which is the most enthusiastic about it. The second is actually the economic side, but an economic side which is very heavily tech focused.
Yes.
Because if one looks at the direction of the global economy, in fact, you look at our own lives, the tech component of what we use and do and live amidst is increasing. And this what you can call it the knowledge economy, the information embedded economy, I think has created again a very powerful new convergence between us. Because at a global level, the United States will need partners, India will need opportunities and possibilities. So to me, if we are today talking about ISET, if you look at American priorities like the IRA and the CHIPS Act, I think these are all factors which will create a stronger sort of bonding. So if you can get I think if the politics works and the economics get stronger, then obviously there's a very, very strong convergence. Now you ask me where could there be or where are the problems? We are both, we are democratic societies, we are incredibly diverse, but we are diverse in very different ways.
Yes.
And we are very internally argumentative and externally, argumentative would be a mild word. So what happens is, I think we will have, there will be occasions where there will be that rub or that friction. And it will happen also because in a globalized world, our arguments are no longer contained in a national sphere. People who have a viewpoint in India will reach out to people who have a similar viewpoint in the US and vice versa. Today, political arguments are very, very global. And often, if you are having a global conversation, but not necessarily a global cultural understanding of each other, I think there's plenty of room there for friction. Often, I read judgments or I hear people say things in the US and sometimes in India too, where we are looking at the other society completely from our own template, from our own experience. And I think that would be an issue.
Well, I certainly would agree that both, from my experience, both Americans and Indians lead the world in moral lectures. We're both of our societies are.
We've
quite
been doing
good.
it longer though.
Yes, no, you have a deeper experience. I won't deny. But kind of along these lines, I know that when Prime Minister Modi was here, a number of American representatives boycotted his address to Congress.
Some did. I don't know if I'd use the word a number.
Well, a number can be a small number.
okay.
It doesn't have to be a big one.
Okay.
And I know I wrote a column about India in the Wall Street Journal, and I got there was a letter to the editor from Cardinal Dolan, who was a very well-respected, a man I personally respect tremendously, to the Journal expressing his concern that I hadn't said enough in my column about problems of religious minorities in India. So how would you sort of try to shape the conversation, or how would you respond to some of these concerns that people have here? It
would be a mix because, I think different people if I don't know Cardinal Dolan, I'm a little more familiar with American politicians, including members of Congress. So I'm not, I know many of them have strong views, often electorally driven, sometimes culturally driven, all of that. So I'm a little hesitant to address specific examples. But as a broad proposition.
Yes.
Look, as a broad proposition, all I can say where India is concerned is the underlying culture of India is deeply pluralistic. In fact, I cannot think of any society in the world, and I've lived in many of them, whether I look at Europe or look at North America, and US is very pluralistic. China, I've lived in Russia. The diversity and the layers that you get in India, and you can slice it in different ways. It could be ethnicity, it could be faith, it could be language, it could be traditions. It's actually unique. It's truly in multiple accesses the most diverse space in the world. Now, it is something, now when you have that kind of diversity, that diversity will always have its own conversations and discussions. It will be, there will be attempts to get a certain balance right, there will be corrections, there will be recorrections. It's in the nature of diversity. The only way you won't have those dialogues is when you don't have diversity, or when you have imposed something so strong that everything is okay in that place because everybody has either been forced to agree or conditioned to agree with each other. So we actually are a much more looser society where there's almost a natural inclination to disagree, and that is our national character. Now, when you have people who have not come through that experience, who for them, are listening, it's like you're listening to the next room, you really don't know the people in the next room, you're picking snatches of conversation, and then you are making a judgment or an opinion based on that particular soundbite that you picked up. So today, since you brought up the issue of minorities in India, look, what is the test really of fair and good governance, or of the balance of a society? It would be whether in terms of the amenities, the benefits, the access, the rights, do you discriminate or not? And in every society in the world, at some point, there's been some discrimination on some basis. So if you look at India today, it's a society today where there's a tremendous change taking place because people are the biggest change happening today in India is the creation of a social welfare system in a society which has less than $3,000 per capita income. Nobody has done that in the world before. Now, when you look at the benefits of that, you look at housing, you look at health, you look at food, you look at finance, you look at access, educational access, health access. There's no, I defy you to show me discrimination. I mean, in fact, the more digital we have become, the more in a way faceless the governance has become. Actually, it's become fairer. But as I said, this is a globalized world. There will be people, you will have people gripe about it, and much of the griping is also political. Let me be very frank with you, because we've also had a culture of vote banks, and there are sections who had in their own eyes a certain privileged access, who today may resent the fact that they don't. It's a phenomenon with which you are not unfamiliar. And I think these will be the turbulence of a democratic society.
Okay. Well, now we in the United States have had the experience not only of lectures from India, but lectures from Canada. And, I think
You know, they look at you as the global south.
Yeah. It's one of the more interesting relationships. And I think Dean Acheson once wrote an essay about Canadian criticisms of the United States, and he titled it "Stern Daughter of the Voice of God." But certainly the Canadian Prime Minister has made some serious charges recently. But I also see that from press reports that you have met while you're in Washington with National Security Advisor Sullivan, with our Secretary of State, Blinken, and that this subject has come up. Can you give us any information about how this is or isn't affecting U.S.-India relations, where this whole matter stands now from your perspective?
Okay. Now, so let me start with Canada. Yes, the Canadian Prime Minister made some allegations, initially privately and then publicly. And our response to him, both in private and public, were that what he was alleging was not consistent with our policy, and that if his government had anything relevant and specific they would like us to look into, we were open to looking at it. Now, that's where that conversation is at this point of time. But to understand that conversation, you have to also appreciate that this has been an issue of great friction for many years with Canada, in fact going back to the 1980s. Then it became dormant, but in the last few years it has come back very much into play because of what we consider to be a very permissive Canadian attitude towards terrorists, extremists, people who openly advocate violence. And they have been given operating space in Canada because of the compulsions of Canadian politics. I don't think most Americans, you know, for Americans, perhaps Canada looks very different. But, you know, it sort of, it depends, you know, from where the interest, where the shoe pinches. For us, it has certainly been a country where organized crime from India mixed with trafficking in people, mixed with secessionism, violence, terrorism. It's a very toxic combination of issues and people who have found operating space there. So a lot of our tensions with Canada, which well preceded what Mr. Trudeau said, actually come out of that. And today I'm actually in a situation where my diplomats are unsafe going to the embassy or to the consulates.
In Canada?
In Canada. They are publicly intimidated. And that has actually compelled me to temporarily suspend even visa operations in Canada. So as I said, you know, often countries look very different depending on how you see them and what your interests are. But I have this problem in Canada. And so your question, did I speak about it with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken? Yes, I did.
And?
No. Let's put it this way. They obviously shared, U.S. views and assessments on this whole situation. And I explained to them at some length, you know, what I gave you was a summary of the concerns which I had. So I think hopefully we both came out of those meetings better informed.
Great, well, thank you. Well, we are about to go to audience questions, and I see I have some here, but while I'm looking at them, do you have any advice for Americans who want to learn more about India? Where should young people or older people who are interested in this, where should they go to learn about this country that is looming larger and larger in American foreign policy and in world affairs?
Look, it's hard to give general advice, but I would say, and this really flows from our own conversation today, that in whatever profession people are, I think it would be useful to try to see how that particular profession or that particular set of interests are doing in India, because there may be experiences there, there may be thoughts there, ideas there, which people would find useful. For many years, India has been an absorber, an active searcher for best practices around the world. I think today we can also contribute to best practices. I give you some very different examples of this. You would have all seen that our very persuasive advocacy of yoga over the last decade has improved global health. So if anybody wants to get up in the morning and wants to have a better day, my suggestion is please, look at your phone and find the most conducive yoga practice. But on the other hand, if you are someone in the digital world and you see really how creatively today, digital mediums and practices are being embraced. And I give you an example. If you are going shopping in India today, you can leave your wallet behind. You can't leave your phone behind, because most likely the person you're buying something from will not accept cash, will want you to pull out your phone, look at the QR code and make a cashless payment. Now, we are clocking, last year we clocked 90 billion cashless financial payments. Just for a reference, the US was about 3, and China was 17.6. This year we probably would exceed. I saw the June figures, it was 9 billion transactions in June alone. So I'm giving you that as an example. Street vendors today will have a QR code on their cart and say, just make your payment there. So it could be digital, it could be wellness, it could be food habits, it could even be, this whole discussion today we have about pluralism, identity, culture, tradition. I think there are things to learn there, and I equally, just so that people don't think I'm back to that moralizing path, I do think Indians too, are getting very global. There, the world comes at you every waking hour through this wonderful instrument we carry with us, and the more we absorb, the better off we are.
Okay, great. Well, now I have some questions from the audience to ask. We have one from one of my fellow press reptiles who is here in the group today, has said that President Biden appeared confident enough in the intelligence about alleged Indian government involvement in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar to raise the issue with Prime Minister Modi at the G20. He asks, what have you done in response to the US and other Western concerns? Maybe we've answered some of this already, but...
Sure. I think I answered that.
You've answered it. Okay, we move on. Yeah. This is from someone at a think tank. We see India playing an increasingly important role in new multilateral groups like the G20, Quad, I2U2, India, Middle East, Economic Corridor, et cetera. Is the Indian government looking to utilize this diplomatic momentum to strengthen more regional groupings such as SAARC, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, particularly the IORA?
Yep. We actually have an IORA meeting next month in Sri Lanka. I'll be going for that. I think we've even tabled an Indo-Pacific Oceans initiative at the East Asia Summit, where we look at non-security aspects of protecting the ocean space. today for us, the challenge is there are new opportunities, there are new combinations, and how do you do that without losing focus of what you have? So it's a kind of it's a bird in the bush and the bird in hand, but you want to keep both of them, and part of the challenge is also to keep the older partners convinced that your interest in what you've been doing for some time remains. The SAARC, SAARC is an exception there. It's currently dormant because one of its members, who will remain unnamed, believes that they can practice terrorism at no cost. So that's an exception. But otherwise, we've been pretty much active, and really even the latest latest initiative we're looking at is this Middle East corridor, which has India at one end and Europe at the other. So it has, for the moment, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it is it's got the US as well as a kind of a guarantor partner, if you would. And it really has a lot of possibilities because, given if we can find a more seamless, effective, competitive logistics between India and Europe, I think it will have enormous consequence for the global economy.
I have a follow-up question from someone else on the same sort of general role question. How do you see India's role changing in the Middle East? And I would add, I think many Americans may understand that there's a close India-Middle Eastern relationship on energy, but also Israel is a primary defense partner with India. And then we have millions of Indians who work in the Gulf countries. So the relationship—
9 million.
Yeah, the relationship is really quite close.
Right.
How do you see India's role developing in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, you, Walter, touched on the energy side. You've touched on the fact that you have 9 million expats in the Gulf. There's also the proximity, the historical connections out there. But we have to understand today that as India becomes a larger consumer, a bigger economy, our salience in the Middle East countries' calculations, especially the Gulf economies, is that much higher. For many countries, I think we are the largest trade partner of the UAE, and we would be among probably the top 3 of the Saudis. And it isn't just the volume of trade. We discovered during COVID, they discovered during COVID, that the Gulf is actually dependent on the daily food consumption for what comes out of India. So the economies have really got very, very deeply meshed. And today the Gulf itself is in transition. If you talk to the leadership in Gulf, they are talking renewables, they're talking green hydrogen, and a lot of them are very enthusiastic in terms of digital progress. So we are finding new areas of intersection with them. And if you look at Indian businesses, we are today far more entrenched in the Middle East than we've been for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have a final question, and then we'll bring this part of the program to a close, which is, again, without mentioning any names, somebody's asked, as we speak today, the situation in India's western neighborhood is deteriorating at a fast pace. There could be a situation where a country could collapse or see unrest. How is India preparing for such an unknown event, or how could it prepare?
In an unnamed country.
In an unnamed country to the west of India.
We have a few countries.
There's more than one option.
Who are having problems of their own. Look, today there are there are countries in different parts of the world in crises of different kinds. And we have a few proximate to us. We saw Sri Lanka, which really went through a very, almost an economic meltdown last year. And we had to step forward because, and they were engaged in a negotiation with the world, with the fund. And their needs were so immediate and so serious that we actually did the largest bilateral lending that we've ever done, which was we gave them almost a package of $4 billion as a way of stabilizing their economy. The unnamed country to our west, which we are talking about, but they have a much, their problems are much more long-term. They're much more deeper historically in terms of what happens when distortions have been introduced into the natural progress of an economy. That if you have, let us say, excessive expenditure on the military, or if your borrowing has not been prudent, or if you have infrastructure which doesn't pay its way, I think there are a lot of factors there in multiple chickens are coming home to roost at the same time.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I know we're all grateful to Minister Jaishankar for his time. I'll ask you to respect that time as we go. He has a very busy schedule today, so he and I will head out here. There is coffee and other assorted delicacies in the back, I'm afraid more American than Indian. And in 15 minutes, we'll reassemble here where there's going to be a panel discussion led by Hudson's Japan chair and a very distinguished fellow and longtime friend of India, Ken Weinstein. And so I hope to see you back for that soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the second part of our India Foundation and Hudson Institute conference, India's Role in a New Pacific Order. I'm Ken Weinstein. I am Japan Chair here at Hudson Institute. Now, we've had this extraordinary conversation already this morning between External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and Hudson Institute Distinguished Fellow Walter Russell Mead. And now we have a remarkable panel of experts to examine what the policy community and what the business community can do together to strengthen the U.S.-India partnership. And I'll say at first that Walter and Minister Jaishankar set an extraordinarily high bar. We will not try to achieve anything near that height, but I think it should be an interesting conversation. And let me just begin immediately just to introduce the people on the panel first. Let me begin immediately to my left is Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha, who is the chairman of the board at the India Foundation. During his time in the Indian Navy, he was Commander-in-Chief of the Western Naval Command, responsible for security in the Arabian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, the Persian Gulf, and he also served prior to that as Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff to the Chief of Staff's Committee. He has been widely decorated in India for his distinguished service. Next to the Admiral is Hudson Institute Senior Fellow Nadia Shadlow. Nadia was, prior to joining Hudson, served as Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, and she is, of course, the principal author of the 2017 National Security Strategy, which really marked a new era in U.S. foreign and security policy. Prior to joining Hudson, she was a Senior Program Officer at the Smith-Richardson Foundation. She also worked previously at the Department of Defense on Eastern European issues and has written widely on supply chain and East Asian issues in her time at Hudson. Next to Nadia is the chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee for Finance, a member of Parliament, Jai Sinha. In the past, he was Minister of State for Finance and Civil Aviation. Prior to his career in public service, Mr. Sinha was a venture capitalist who, like many in the Indian diaspora, lived in the United States 20 years, graduated from Harvard Business School, the University of Pennsylvania, and IIT Delhi. He spent 20 years in Boston, and so he knows both countries extremely well and has a very critical role in the Indian Parliament. Lastly is our old friend Steve Began. Steve is now Senior Vice President of Global Public Policy at the Boeing Company. Steve, of course, served as Deputy Secretary of State and had an important portfolio that, especially dealing with India. Prior to serving as Deputy Secretary of State, Steve was a Corporate Vice President at the Ford Motor Company, and prior to that, he served with great distinction as Chief of Staff at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and also as Executive Secretary of the National Security Council here in Washington. So we're going to have hopefully a free-flowing conversation. There were a number of very important themes that were raised by Minister Jaishankar in his conversation. But let me begin first by turning to the Admiral. Let me turn to the Quad first of all. You obviously have deep experience in defense issues. Follow defense transformation quite closely. Now, with the signing of the Japan-Australia Reciprocal Access Agreement in 2022 and the 2021 announcement of the Australia-UK-US Strategic Partnership, AUKUS, the US, Australia, and Japan have significantly deepened already longstanding defense ties to each other. Do you think India will ever have these kinds of ties with its fellow Quad members? Does it even want them? And where should India's role in the Quad be heading?
Well, thank you, Ken, for the good introduction that you gave for me, though it's been a long time since I left service. Coming to Quad, it started in quite some time back, and I think that the other partnerships that you mentioned, AUKUS or maybe South Korea, Japan, and US, these are all complementary to each other. And I look at it in a very broad way You see, today we are doing all this so that we can maintain the existing order, or we can have what is called the free and open seas, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And for that to happen, these countries have to come together in various kind of groupings that you have. You have these groupings because Indo-Pacific is a very, very big area. And you have the Indian Ocean, you have some of the partnerships which are very specific to, more important to Indian Ocean, some are specific to South China Sea, and some are specific to the Pacific. So I think these are all complementary to each other, they will all survive. And India has very much great interest in Indian Ocean and the Pacific, as the Minister mentioned this morning. So my sense is that, yes, India is very much part of all this. It will continue to remain a very important part of the Quad.
And in terms of, I mean, you drew there a very subtle distinction between the different regional areas that the Quad is handling. In terms of, do you, and India has obviously a different role to play in each of those areas, as do the other members of the Quad, but there obviously seems to be more of a focus on the South China Sea from 3 members of the Quad, and arguably less of a focus in India. Do you see that changing at all?
I think our policy of one China policy does not permit us to get militarily involved in the South China Sea. However, the Chief of Naval Staff is on record to say that should India's economic interests, they get disturbed, the Indians will very much, make themselves present and see how they can get over it. Having said that, in case the Taiwan Strait crisis it deepens, and suppose it, heads towards a war-like situation, then I'm sure as a Quad partner, as a partner of Malabar, India will do all that has been expected from India to do, except for possibly physically participating in the war.
Great, thank you. Let me turn it now to Nadia Shadlow. Nadia, you've written widely on supply chain issues, and obviously you also played a critical role dealing with your Indian interlocutors as Deputy National Security Advisor. Part of the Quad focus under the Biden administration has been to try to bring about secure supply chains. Where do you see this heading? How successful has this been? And what do you think we need to do together between India and the United States outside of the Quad framework?
I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think India has actually been in the lead on a lot of these opportunities, and in some ways faster than the US. So very recently, for instance, a big facility now will be built by Micron in India, hundreds of millions of dollars, ground has just broken. And what's interesting is that they're predicting output in a year. Whereas in the US, we have a CHIPS Act, which is still sort of enmeshed in bureaucracy, and we're, I'm not really sure what's happening, right? I mean, it's moving along, but we could move faster. But that's just one area of potential partnership. I think most important is that India and the United States are aligned, as the minister said previously, in understanding what this new architecture of globalization needs to look like. What does the architecture look like? It doesn't look like the way that it has over the past 10 years. And India has been very important, and especially, the foreign minister, in articulating that. I think one of my favorite lines from his speech at the UN was, we aspire to be a leading power to take on greater responsibility and make greater contributions. And I really like that. It defines the areas that also the US and India can work on together. So supply chain issues, but increasing defense cooperation issues, looking at secure ICT around the world, in actually implementing and operationalizing these shifts. And I think there's the leadership today in both countries is committed to that.
Thank you, Nadia. Let me now turn to Chairperson, Chairman Sinha. You just heard Nadia noting somehow something that is a little cognitive dissonance for some of us, that the United States is actually more bureaucratic in some ways than India, which is, I think, but it's probably music to your ears given your role on the Standing Committee for Finance and your experience here in the United States. Let me shift gears a little bit. You're here in Washington for a number of reasons, but in part you're here for meetings with the multilateral development banks. You heard Minister Jaishankar's discussion of the need to reform these institutions. What do you think needs to be done, and in particular, what needs to be done to better meet the needs of the Global South?
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you at the Hudson Institute for hosting a wonderful program. We were, of course, very fortunate to hear Minister Jaishankar give a very eloquent, analysis of geopolitics and India's position therein. And one of the issues that he alluded to, which you are touching on as well, is really a reform of the global architecture, particularly the multilaterals. And to that end, of course, as I said, I'll be having some meetings later on at the World Bank and the IMF to talk about what we can do with the multilateral development banks. That's really been front and center and right on top of the agenda on a number of different discussion fora. Most recently at the G20, where there was a very important declaration on MDB reform. And as Minister Jaishankar correctly said, India has gone from dealing with the United States to actually working with the United States. And when it comes to the multilateral development banks, we are in fact working very closely with the United States to reposition the multilateral development banks and many other elements of the global financial architecture to actually address the very important financing needs of the Global South. And let me just sharpen that point a little bit, Ken, because I think it's very important for us to recognize the stakes. We've talked about national security, very important there to build up the defense ecosystem, semiconductor supply chain, as Nadia mentioned. But equally, what we haven't spoken about so far is climate change. And as far as the Global South is concerned, if we don't get the support of the North, either from a financial point of view or in terms of technological resources, we are not going to be able to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and be able to bring the world back in equilibrium. And for that, the multilateral development banks have to completely be transformed. And that's a very important area for India and the United States to be working together. And of course, with Prime Minister Modi's visit here to the US in June, where there was a very strong statement of intent to that effect, and then separately at the G20, again, even in the bilateral, and then of course in the overall Leaders Summit declaration, again, the importance of transforming the entire global architecture to address these existentialist crises is very much on top of the agenda. And that's a fantastic opportunity for India and the US to work together on a variety of fronts. Financing, of course, I've just mentioned, but also technology, very importantly, whether we talk about decarbonization technologies, you talk about nuclear technologies, you talk about transportation technologies, again, a tremendous area for working together. And then, of course, in the entire sort of industrial ecosystem as well. If we've got to build batteries, if you've got to build photovoltaic panels and so on, unless the India and the US ecosystems, the economic ecosystems come together, it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to get to sustainable prosperity. So we are at a very important juncture. We have to work together, and absolutely integral to that is the reform of the global architecture to do that, whether it is the MDBs or even as Minister Jaishankar mentioned, the UN, because that's the only way we can deal with and manage the massive global challenges that we are confronting right now.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, an important one with regard to the UN. Obviously, we saw the failure of UN institutions with regard to preventing the Ukraine war, and just the inabilities of those institutions really to react as such. And as a result, we saw both the revitalization of both the G7 under Japanese leadership and to a certain degree the G20, which was revitalized, though not focusing as much on Ukraine, under India's leadership. India's vision of reforming the UN, would it empower the UN to deal with crises like this?
We have to. Do we have a choice, Ken? We really have to take the multilateral institutions as they are right now and strengthen them. And exactly as Minister Jaishankar said, that if we want to move to a more equitable, prosperous world, the multilateral institutions have a very important role to play, but they are largely Western constructs right now. And that's exactly why they're not able to do their job. Somebody like India not being on the Security Council is indeed, just a very clear example of that failure of governance that we have globally right now. And that's part of the reason why the multilaterals are not able to step up. And Minister Jaishankar correctly said that, we have a reformist view. We don't have a revisionist view. We don't want to turn the clock back. We want to take what we have and move it forward by reforming it and making it much more equitable and much more inclusive so we can address these very real challenges.
Thank you. Steve, let me ask you, you have been involved in U.S.-India relations, for many years, and we have been together in Delhi a couple of times before you were back in government, and seeing all the extraordinary progress that we have seen in the U.S.-India relationship, the partnership, there is still a sense in some circles that Indian and American policymakers are talking past each other. Have you seen this? Where do we need to go to make more progress in the relationship?
Well, thanks, Ken. As a longtime participant in U.S. foreign policy decision-making, I long ago came to the conclusion that in international relations, disappointment is the delta between expectations and reality. That's not a call for low expectations, but a call for setting the expectations in a practical and achievable manner. To have been involved with the U.S.-India relationship over 30 years is let me just say, it's not one would not have been spared by moments of frustration, and I think that's fair to say on both sides. But I think in some ways the Indians are actually coming to grips with this evolving relationship more quickly than we are, but we're getting there. And we're getting there not just because we have a maturing view of India, but because we have also other priorities that in relative terms force us to confront this talking past each other that I think you quite accurately identify as been a feature of the relationship. But all that said, if you put the U.S.-India trajectory on a graph, it would at a distance appear to be an uninterrupted improvement in relations over the past 30 years. There's just no question. There will be moments where the line might flatten out a little bit. There's moments where it might dip or it might peak. We can all think of those moments in the past 3 decades. But one of the great credits to the U.S. political system is that both Republican and Democratic presidents successively have taken a U.S.-India relationship that they inherited and left it in a better place. And I think that's even the case with administrations as different as George W. Bush's, from Barack Obama's, from Donald Trump's to Joe Biden's. That we have been on an uninterrupted trajectory in the right direction. The minister made a very good point that's worth underscoring, that one of the challenges in the relationship has been our tendency to project on the other side our understandings of how our political system works, our expectations or our understandings of our interests as they are, rather than meeting each other where we actually are. And I think, again, I have to give a little bit more credit to the Indians than to my colleagues in the U.S. foreign policy establishment for having arrived at that. If I was objectively assessing the performance of governments and how they grappled with what many parts of the world saw as a very disruptive presidency during President Trump's presidency, there's a few countries that came out of that period having handled it better than India. And why is that? I think it tells us a little bit about how India sees itself. The interests prevail above all, and pursuing those interests sometimes requires a deft and patient approach. For us, it is a requirement to see India not as the way we might have a generation ago, where as bizarre as it may seem, held up against today's realities, India would have been just another developing country among a non-aligned movement. That is not what India is, and it's frankly never what India was. India's size and its scale and its potential in the world among U.S. partners is equal to only a handful of nations, and possibly the European Union. I think, honestly, we made the same mistake with China as well, with some negative repercussions over time, the way we looked at China and not understanding the size and the scale and the potential of China and how it would impact the world. But with India, we just have to I think we have to set aside some of those notions that we might have held a generation ago and look at India as a major power. And I think that's going to help us free up the partnership that we all want to have.
Ken, I'm sorry to interrupt very quickly here. I just wanted to say that, as a business person, not as a person who spent his whole life in politics, and I don't really have just an inside the Beltway view. I have a view of Boston and Silicon Valley and New York. And a lot of the friction and concerns that people have in DC are not shared when you get outside the Beltway. And if you look at the India-US relationship, it has blossomed well beyond the frictions of Delhi and Washington because of the business, academic, cultural, and people-to-people linkages that have happened. And it's well beyond just thinking about it from a Beltway perspective. And that's part of the reason why we have this momentum and dynamism in this relationship, because this natural partnership that's happening at a very organic level is, in fact, driving even the strategic interests now.
Chairman, listen, let me ask you a personal question. You obviously you were immensely successful, and you could have had an extraordinarily nice life in Boston, nice vacation homes, et cetera, and you decided to go back to India. And there's so much talk about the Indian diaspora as so critical to the future of the U.S.-India relationship. Did this happen suddenly? For those of us who are not familiar with your personal story, I think it's a fascinating one, and I think it kind of embodies much of where we see the dynamism in India today.
Well, I come from a political family, and many members of my family have either been in politics or in the civil services. So I always felt that, once I had achieved what I wanted to do professionally, it was important for me to give back to my country, which is where I'm from and which is why I was successful in the first instance. And really the question for me and for many people in the diaspora also, I think, is that if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? So it really is that call to action. And obviously that's part of the reason why the relationship and partnership is getting stronger every day.
Thank you. Nadia, let me turn to you. We're obviously seeing, and the minister talked earlier about reglobalization in his remarks. Now that reglobalization, in a sense, that India is pursuing inherently, as you've mentioned earlier and have mentioned earlier in your writing, involves a certain amount of de-risking from China. And in a sense, that movement will bring India closer to the West than it currently is over time, even if there has been significant progress over the last few decades. Now, as that happens, how do you see that impacting India's role as kind of voice of the global South? Do you see will India eventually be forced to choose between the West and the global South?
I mean, I think that's a question more for my Indian interlocutors, but I think India has made clear it doesn't intend to choose between the two. And I think the United States is sort of also moving away from a sense of you have to make a choice, right? A recognition that instead of that dialogue, really, it's more about what happens in practice, right? The operationalizing of these new connections of new manufacturing hubs and centers, new ecosystems around the world centered on technology and manufacturing. And so I think in practice, we will benefit from a renewed India, which is open to being a center for manufacturing and in a whole range of areas, right? We saw that with Apple. So I think it will be about operationalizing than less about forcing both countries, forcing India to take a side, because it's not going to take a side, right? As Indian leaders have said, it's about their national interests, and their interest is to remain a participant across the board. I think, de facto, this relationship will end up helping us achieve more diversification in our supply chains, and change the vulnerabilities that we currently have. But it's about the operationalizing.
Great, thank you. Admiral, let me ask you, there's so much talk, obviously, here in Washington around the world about the new Cold War, the return to a bipolarity between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Now, some have argued, and particularly in Japan, that what we're looking at now is not going to be over time a bipolar world, but potentially a tripolar world as India becomes this pole of deeper attraction both to the global south through its manufacturing prowess, through its economic prowess. And do you see this, do you see a possible tripolarity? Do you see do you see India pulling closer to the US? Do you have any sense, I mean, what's your sense of the future strategic landscape?
You know, somehow I don't agree that it's going to be a tripolar world or a bipolar world, mainly because if you see the economy and the scientific developments in most of the countries, the gap with the US or any other advanced country has reduced quite a lot. And therefore, you will have many contenders of leading those poles in various parts of the world. And I just broadly mentioned that, you know, I see this entire Indo-Pacific certainly in 3 sections. And you find that the countries in these sections by themselves are economically and scientifically, they're so advanced that they can actually become their own poles. But what US is doing right now, to our opinion, that US has realized or accepted the multipolarity of the world. And that is why all these, you know, Quad, you have Malabar, you have so many of these, you know, the togetherness. So I think that with the ISET coming into being, US is also having accepted the multipolarity. It is also doing technopolarity, if you like. So technologically, if they got 3-4 poles, which the US wants to see, so that it's the gap of China and US in a very broader sense, that reduction, the reduction in gap can be prevented. So you have too many of these small centers, technically capable, militarily capable, and economically capable, so that China doesn't get to spread its wing the way it was thinking it would do.
And where do you see where do you see were the greatest poles of attraction for India in that? Now, which nations do you see it? Do you see most following the Indian example?
Well, I really I think that India is a big democracy, and positively the democracy is sort of gelled together. Because if it is a chaotic system, it is chaotic everywhere. Or if the decision makings are delayed, all my co-panelists have said that. And I'm glad you have a good impression of Indian bureaucracy. We tend to believe that our bureaucracy is, you know, is the slowest. But I think you know, the pull of the democracy is just like it is in Quad, that will continue to be main attraction. And most of the democracies will probably look at this as an example.
I think one area where you know, India is making a big contribution is in global STEM talent, right? And the model that India seems to have seems to be one that maybe the US could learn from, where we've struggled for decades, over a decade, in producing the sort of STEM talent that our country needs. But separately, I wanted to make one point that could be, just so that we're not all in agreement, and just to add, you know, add some potential area of disagreement could be in a future Republican administration. I think there is less confidence in the ability of the large multilateral institutions to accomplish things. And I think that you will definitely see much more of building on the coalition side, AUKUS, other countries. So I think that's one area of potential, you know, pushback, a sense of we can't work through these institutions that have not performed well for now, you know, in many respects. And some of the key challenges, whether it's climate, whether it's electrification, power, energy, and security, that there'll be a pressure to move around them or to work within them in smaller coalitions. But just a thought.
Yeah, and let me on that point, let me turn to Chairman Sinha and ask about the role of the private sector, with which you alluded to earlier, with regard to the MDBs, which I think in a future Republican administration, obviously there would be a greater focus on trying to leverage private capital and to try to do so more successfully than has been done in the past. Your thoughts on that?
Ken, that's exactly right. And Nadia is correct to say that we have the same diagnosis, which is that the multilateral institutions have not done the job that they were supposed to do. Now we have a choice. Either we discard them and go to bilateral relationships, or we reform them. And we've taken the position that we should reform them because unlike the US in some ways, we also believe that we represent the voice of the global South and the interests of the global South. Because it definitely looks to India for leadership, and which is the statement that you were alluding to from Minister Jaishankar at the UN as well, where he said, we need leadership because we want to take on more responsibility, and part of that responsibility is representing the interests of the global South. That won't be served in a bilateral situation. Can India forge something with the US and serve its needs? Yes. But that doesn't serve the rest of the global South. So we have no choice, as I said. We have to reform these multilateral institutions so that they don't just work for India, but they work for the world. And that's something we have to undertake. We have no other choice to do it that way. And part of the reform process of the multilateral institutions is to be able to enable the private sector. And we really have to transform these multilateral development banks from being ones where they are just providing loans to sovereigns to actually stimulating the private sector and working with the private sector, because that's the only way this is going to happen. Let me throw a number at you. The global South needs to get to net zero somewhere between $2 to $4 trillion a year. $2 to $4 trillion a year. The MDBs, the philanthropies, the governments of the world just simply don't have that kind of financing capacity. It has to come from private sector. And therefore, the role of the MDBs is really to be a catalyst for the private sector. It's going to have to be one that is driven and led by the private sector. And that's where we are philosophically very much in alignment with the US's thinking in this regard. But it's got to work for everybody.
Thank you. Steve, let me ask you about the trade agenda between the US and India. What do we need to do on the policy side as you see things?
Did I mention that it can be frustrating to work on? I actually think it's broader than just the trade relationship, Ken. Just as I was speaking about an evolution in how we are thinking about India as a political military power, I think we also have to very much think long and hard about how Western businesses in particular look at India as a trading partner and as an investment location. In the decade and a half I was with Ford Motor Company, we were rather aggressive in moving out to build a presence in India with manufacturing facilities in Chennai and Sanand in the state of Gujarat. We had IT, a little bit of engineering, headquarters in Delhi. I left the company in 2018. In the 5 years since, Ford has pretty much completely exited the market. The state-of-the-art facility that was built in Sanand was closed, and the facility in Chennai was likewise Ford exited. And I've pondered in those years since how all that hard work didn't come to fruition. And I think that it illustrates for me a reality of how Western businesses are going to have to approach the Indian market in order to succeed. And in short, I think the lesson might be we have to become Indian businesses. India has for a long time made sense and will continue at some level to make sense as a place for lower cost sourcing, for excellent engineering talent, for backroom IT services. All those things will continue to serve a purpose to benefit Western businesses in their global business. But it has a very low ceiling. And I think that if I look back in hindsight, what I'd see is that you're going to hit that low ceiling, especially in business to consumer businesses, that in the end, when you reach kind of the point of that continuum where you want to enter the Indian market on scale, what you end up doing is simply exporting an expensive business model into India and not succeeding against the local competition. And so, to get to the part of the Indian business in trade and investment that's the high ceiling, it's going to be to try to become an Indian company, essentially. And I think that's where the opportunity is. And then the trade flows will come, but they will be intercompany trade flows. They won't necessarily be building something at scale in India and exporting it globally, particularly in markets that are deeply sensitive on tariff issues to a lower cost product coming out of India, and won't provide market access absent a reciprocal free trade agreement, which to me seems deeply challenging from all recent experience. So I think, particularly in the business to consumer businesses, but also more broadly, in a country of 1.4 billion people, with the future potential, the current and future potential that India has, we have to look at it differently. This is very different than simply a low-cost sourcing strategy or building something inexpensively and exporting around the world. We have to think about it like we think our own country. How do we build our industries, and how do we become part of that in India? A big question I would have is, if companies do that, will they be seen and treated as an Indian company as well? But I think you have a much better chance of acquiring that level of treatment, for better or for worse, quite frankly, because the bureaucracy and things like that are real for any company. I think you have a better chance of succeeding as an Indian company.
Wow. Let me ask the Chairman Sinha about his reaction, because that's to me that sounds like quite a warning to those who are looking to India, including a number of major American companies that are trying to de-risk and move out of China, looking to India potentially as a manufacturing center.
Well, it's a reality check, not a warning. And if you look at the automotive sector in India, Maruti and Hyundai, a Korean company and a Japanese company, have been super successful. Sure. So it's not as if companies are not successful in India, but it's exactly what Steve said, is that if you want to be a large-scale player in India, in Indian business, you have to be an Indian business. I cannot be an Indian business in America. If I want to be successful in America and build a multi-billion-dollar business, I've got to be an American company, which, by the way, our IT services companies have also learned, right? Exactly as they have transformed themselves. So that's a truism for business everywhere. If you want to build a large-scale, successful business, you have to be operating as a very domestic business with all of the competitive factors of production that you have to marshal. And that's true for an American business in India, it's true for a European business, it's true for a Japanese business. But those that master that, whether it's a Unilever, whether it's a Maruti, whether it's an HSBC, whether it is some of the other very successful multinationals who are in India, they then are able to not only do very, very well in India's market, which is vast now, and of course, we are the fifth, soon to be the third largest economy in the world, but also they become a production platform for the rest of the world. Because what you do is you are able to master the value engineering, the affordability, the very competitive manufacturing that is required to be successful in India. And that translates very well, not just to South Africa and Indonesia, but also to the US also. So some of the most affordable tractors in the US are being made by Mahindra. Right? So it becomes a production platform for a particular type of customer, which is much more affordability-oriented and value-oriented.
And I mean, there's some talk now that artificial intelligence, and you can't have a panel these days in Washington without mentioning it, so I've mentioned it, but that is going to allow for a kind of transformation with regard to manufacturing for places like India to sort of achieve at a much lower cost the kind of craftsmanship that has eluded in certain sectors. I don't know.
Well, we are worried about it on the other side, which is like if you end up automated programming and so on, then we can lose some of our IT services, exports, etc. So we don't know which way it's going to cut yet. So we have to wait and see.
Let me turn it to the audience for questions here, and let me ask, please identify yourself, ask a question, and direct it to somebody on the panel if you prefer to. Thank you, and try to keep the question short. Yes, thank you.
My name is Siddhant Kishore. I'm a student at the American University and also an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. My question to the panel is about freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So one consensus in the United States is that the warm reception of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the partnership agreements that were followed, the understanding is to have India on its side in a likely invasion of Taiwan, or perhaps a more coercive assertiveness in South China Sea. So to what extent is India willing to contribute in this collective deterrence in the Indo-Pacific led by the United States? If yes, will New Delhi be engaging in freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea with other client states of the United States? Thank you.
Admiral, you want to take and then Nadia?
When it comes to freedom of navigation, the Indian articulation has been that we believe in free and open sea. But that India will do as far as its trade is concerned, not for war fighting. Because when you're in a situation like war, then you have to be an ally. And we are not an ally. Independently, the Indian warships are actually doing freedom of navigation. They are warned by the Chinese quite often. But that's it. It stops there. We have to traverse through that route, not only for our commercial ships, but also for our warships, which go to many other ports taking that way. So I think that we are already doing it, but as a part of a task force or something, I suspect that will not happen till such time you become an ally, which I don't foresee happening.
On the adjacent side, I mean, just a very small issue, but the U.S. and India have just apparently signed a defense cooperation agreement to allow refueling of ships at sea.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's a signal in a direction or not, but.
They're already doing that in South China Sea, because last Malabar exercise, it happened in South China Sea. So all 4 navies were operating, they were fueling with each other, so it's okay. You will get to hear from them, but it stops there.
Yeah.
Mr. Sinha, can I ask you a more domestic question? So back when demonetization was done, the black money in the real estate took a hit, and then a lot of homes became affordable for the middle class. Since then, we have become a more digital economy. At the same time, the black money has risen again in the Indian real estate. So my question is the government thinking about phasing out the 500 rupee notes, because that's probably the biggest note, and then that probably could help stabilize the real estate and then we make it more affordable again?
Well, I'll have to reject your statement where you say that there's more black money in real estate now, which isn't true, because we brought in a number of controls to prevent cash usage in real estate transactions or in transactions in general. And of course, because of the circle rates having gone up and so on, if you do a transaction that looks very dubious, it's instantly flagged. And as a result of that, plus of course the real estate regulations that have come in through RERA, I think real estate as such in India now is very much being operated the right way in the legal and correct way now. So I'm not sure I would agree with your proposition at all. And as far as the currency question is concerned, I think the Reserve Bank of India has been very clear about its policies in that regard.
Thank you very much. My name is Rajendra Singh. I'm working with the World Bank. My question is, in telecom equipment manufacturing, currently South Korea, China, and to some extent Europe, they are dominating the market. How India and US can work together so that we also have our share of the pie, particularly in telecom equipment manufacturing. I know India is doing a lot of work on 5G indigenous technology development. So can there be a good collaboration between the two countries? Thank you.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that's an important area of cooperation and possibility, and also in pushing for standards that benefit both of our countries, right, in international standards bodies. So I think it's a great opportunity to move, in that direction. I think when Steve was at the State Department, you'll know more, but there was an effort to sort of work on clean networks and working together to produce, to develop clean networks in the ICT area.
Yeah. So I think the economic imperative can't be separated out from the national security imperative when it comes to networks. And we've seen cooperation with a number of countries, including India. We have to recognize that collaboration is going to be essential in order to get the economies of scale, because ultimately price has been one of the driving factors for the spread of certain technologies from certain sources in the networks of countries around the world. And also, just as with chip manufacturing, the United States allowed its own capacity in this area to atrophy over a number of decades. That's being reversed now, but it's very important that we not only find a way to scale up quickly, but find partners, and India would be an excellent partner. India's got huge ambitions as still largely an importer of telecommunications equipment, in the United States and India working together, I think could create the foundation for quite a bit of success. It's going to require regulatory steps that are going to allow that. It's going to stand on a foundation of trust between the United States and India along the lines that Nadia just described, the trusted network approach that the United States pioneered. But I think in broad strokes, the United States and India do see this very similarly.
Can I add?
Yeah, please, yeah.
I must tell you that the ICT agreement, which is stands between by India and US, it is articulated in this document that US and India will work and use the ICT to develop both military and civil communication technologies, including 5G, advanced technology like 5G. So it is part of the one of the agreement paragraphs in the ICT document. So there is no doubt that it will improve. It may take a little bit of time. A lot of money is being sort of sunk into this from both sides. So hopefully you will see it.
George, and then we'll go to Cleo.
My name is Madhukar Adi. I'm from Houston, Texas. I work for JP Morgan Chase and active community member. The relation in the industry of aviation between India and Boeing, it goes probably around 8 to 9 decades. That's when the journey started. My question is, a lot of developments happened in terms of collaboration, like in India, like research and development, supply chain and all that, but are there any plans for Boeing to have the direct manufacturing that can happen in India in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, I do want to credit Chairman Sinha for his incredible contribution to deepening Boeing's relationship with India. And Boeing has a very successful business. Boeing is today the largest aerospace manufacturer in India. And we do have manufacturing in India in different parts of our business, keeping in mind that we're a full spectrum aerospace company, not just in commercial aviation, but also in defense, in services and space. In the aftermath of Prime Minister Modi's very successful visit this year, we've expanded plans in India in some particular areas of focus that we discussed with the Prime Minister, including increasing the number of women involved in aviation in India, which is a real opportunity because, quite frankly, aviation, both in the manufacturing side as well on the operating side, is facing a huge deficit of talent right now globally because of the expanding demand for air travel around the world. We're also expanding in a number of areas that are important building blocks for a business with potential to grow in any direction we want. We're building facilities for the maintenance and repair and overhaul of aircraft in several locations, both in partnership with the Indian Air Force as well as on a commercial basis. The sky is the limit. But we have to proceed up a progression to see what potential there is in the market. Aerospace industry, particularly on the commercial side, is a duopoly between two companies right now, although Boeing has an excellent partnership with Hindustan Aerospace Limited as well. So we're deeply involved in the Indian market, both as a manufacturer of significant portions of the aircraft, as well as with the commercial carriers themselves, which have also been transformed. Again, Chairman, under your leadership, the privatization of the industry in India has unleashed the potential for huge growth with several Chinese airlines, including Air India, but also Indigo and Akasa. And it's very much a market competition now too. So there will also be certain imperatives on how you find the most competitive way to do business, not just with Indian aerospace companies and carriers, but also with global markets. So I think it would be premature to make any predictions on where this future goes. But I would just say that the ceiling seems very high if one grows the business strategically, like we hope to do in India.
Thank you, Steve. But I will say now that for India, the sky is not the limit. We landed Chandrayaan 3 on the south pole of the moon, so we are reaching for the stars now.
and as a space company as well, it wasn't lost on us that price tag was $70 million for that.
That's right. We did it very affordably, and that is one of India's great
and
strengths.
successfully.
And I can say to you as the former aviation minister that we are very committed to growing the entire aviation ecosystem, aerospace, space, all of that in India. It's obviously commercially very important. It's strategically very important for India, and we look to valued partners like Boeing, like Airbus and others to actually start to really grow Indian manufacturing in aviation and in aerospace as well. You should know that as far as defense is concerned, we are going to be starting to assemble full planes on the defense side. And we very much want to be able to also make commercial airliners. We already make smaller 19-seaters, which we are doing in Kanpur right now. So there's no reason why we can't eventually be able to make commercial airliners as well, which of course, Boeing and Airbus and others will help us get there. But given how large our aviation market is and how fast it's growing, and again, the fact that India can serve as a very valuable production platform for the world, I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen. When, I can't tell you 10 years, 20 years, but definitely, in that time horizon, we should be building full airliners in India.
Great. We have time for two more questions. First, George Bogdan in the back row, and then we go to Cleo Pascal in the back row.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. My name is George Bogdan. I'm a research fellow at Columbia University and a Hudson alum. Recently, the new president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ambassador Froman, said that one of his objectives is to rebuild the Washington Consensus. And I wonder, in American-Indian relations, whether you think that that kind of project has a kind of inherent irritant in that it suggests a kind of pretension for universality in how Washington might see things. So if you have any comment on that, appreciate it. Thanks.
I'm not sure I know what the Washington Consensus is on India, but I will say, I will repeat what I said earlier, which is the trajectory is quite good. I don't think we're in any desperate need of a rebuild in U.S.-India relations, and so I didn't see the comment, so I don't want to unfairly disagree with the gentleman who said it. But I will say that I think the most pressing need in the U.S.-India relationship is some hard work. We already have a very ambitious agenda, and it's one that, thankfully, as a foreign policy professional, I find is supported by the largest part of the spectrum of American politics when it comes to foreign policy priorities. The India relationship is one that's cherished by both Republicans and Democrats in the United States of America. So we don't really, from the U.S. perspective at least, I don't see any need to rebuild anything. What I see the real opportunity ahead of us is to build as fast as we can.
I think it's probably, I would just add, probably the wrong phrase to use, right, based on especially what the foreign minister said earlier. So it should be a consensus around a set of principles, right? But a phrase like that probably doesn't, is not going to achieve what he wants. But I like to think in terms of the specific principles around which we can, share, that we share, and then identifying those.
No, I think there is a difference in worldview at some level between what I hear from my friends in America and how we in India see the world. And this Washington Consensus comment touches on that to some extent. We are not going back to the post-Cold War era. That is, 1990s. I mean, I grew up in that world. I loved it. I enjoyed it. But we are not going back to that. The world is very different. It's not going to be a unipolar world. I don't even think it's going to be a bipolar world. It's going to be very much a multipolar world, which is the view we have in India. Minister Jaishankar has articulated it very, very well in his own book. And when we are in a multipolar world, to try and reach back to a consensus that existed in the 90s, Committee to Save the World, all of that talk, I don't think we can go back to all of that. We're going to have a much more complicated, much more dynamic, much more fluid world of shifting alliances, multipolar power centers, and we're going to have to grapple and deal with that. That introduces a lot of complexity, and people like to go back to simplicity, but frankly, that's not the world we're in now.
And I think the other factor that makes that really impossible is that the post-World War II era wasn't just about the era, it was about the war. And if you think about the nature of the security relationships and alliances the United States formed in the aftermath of that war with countries like Germany and Japan, with countries across NATO, and after the Korean War with Korea as well. These were countries that were ravaged by conflict and that were laid bare for the political contest that existed in that era of the Cold War, and necessitated, in the view of the United States of America, the need to have strong treaty alliance relationships with stationed U.S. forces, oftentimes, almost in all cases, inside the countries with which we had those security relationships. We're in a very different world now, and this is not going to be what the U.S.-India security relationship looks like. It's going to be less akin to a marriage of interests and mutual defense commitments, a legally based marriage of sorts, and more of a common law marriage approach of two countries which have a deep appreciation for each other and see strong interests in working together and deepening that relationship over time. It doesn't make it a weaker relationship. It's just a fact of history that it's not going to have the attributes of the countries that emerged from the devastation of World War II or the war on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, let's turn it to Cleo Pascal for the last question.
Goodness, I better keep it short then. Cleo Pascal, FDD. A quick question on the Pacific issue of this. With Prime Minister Modi going to the Pacific Islands, that's clearly become a priority for India. They're under a lot of PRC political warfare effort, which is something that India has seen in the Indian Ocean. So for the Admiral, if there are lessons learned from how India has handled PRC political warfare in the Indian Ocean Islands that are relevant for the Pacific Islands, and if I may, Dr. Shadlow, if there are things areas where the U.S. and India could work together in the Pacific Islands, and whether that would be welcomed by India, perhaps, Chairman. Thank you.
Well, India is quite happy to call this entire region as Indo-Pacific, as you know. Also, the conferences that we are having, more and more we are tending to get the Pacific Island countries into our fold. So it is actually work in progress, and I suspect that the U.S. taking everybody together in this entire Indo-Pacific will be quite welcome, because we are there to assist these countries. We are already helping them to develop their capability. Some of these capabilities which are the lawmaker mentioned now, and our foreign minister mentioned about it. For example, the communication, other technologies, skill development, financial transaction, digitization. So those kind of soft approaches India is already doing with this country. But making it more security related, I think we are some distance away.
I think that we could actually do a lot in other areas. Critical minerals is one area as well. Seabed mining is a really important area, and it also helps to diversify our in that area, which we need, right? And secondly, I think also in terms of infrastructure building, we can work with the Indians on some infrastructure-specific projects. I think it's a really great opportunity, and I think it's good that the leaders of the Pacific Islands came to Washington last week, and it was an important initiative by the Biden administration that we should give them credit for.
Other comments? Well, on that note, I'd like to wrap things up. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the India Foundation. I want to thank you and the audience, and this really was a remarkable conversation. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
So